A monastery bell tolls in the dead of night. Inside, a candlelit stone chamber flickers with shadows. A boy kneels, trembling, as a priest raises a whip carved with iron tips. The boy whispers a prayer, but no answer comes. The lash falls. His cry echoes against the crucifix, and the priest whispers, "This is God's will. This is not a medieval myth." This was the lived reality for countless children under the very men sworn to protect them. If stories like this disturb you, and they should, subscribe now for more forbidden truths hidden behind centuries of silence. And tell us in the comments, do you believe faith justifies cruelty? The year is 600 AD. Rome, once an empire of emperors and legions, now belongs to priests and bishops. The marble halls where senators debated are silent. The new power is not Caesar, but the Pope. And in this fragile new age, where famine, war, and plague gnaw at the people's hope, one figure stands above all. Pope Gregory thus, Gregory the Great. History remembers Gregory as a saint, a reformer, the man who gave the church its order. But buried beneath the hymns and sermons lies a darker truth. Gregory's teachings, spread across monasteries, cathedrals, and schools, created a system where children, the most vulnerable souls, became vessels of suffering in the name of salvation. For Gregory, every child was born stained with sin. Innocence was not a natural state, but a lie. He wrote of discipline as a holy weapon, a means to purge the flesh of weakness and train the soul for obedience. And so, in the shadow of the crumbling Roman world, monasteries filled with orphans and novices became places not of refuge, but of fear. Imagine a stone monastery in the hills of Italy. The night air is thick with smoke from oil lamps. In the dormitory, boys no older than 8 kneel on cold stone floors. A monk walks the row, whip in hand. Each lash is followed by a prayer for your soul, for your purity. To the outside world, this is discipline. Inside, it is cruelty sanctified. Gregory never swung the whip himself, but his words gave priests permission. His pastoral rule demanded strict correction, even of children, and priests obeyed with zeal. Children who whispered, who questioned, who showed defiance, were beaten. Those who resisted fasting were locked in cells, left with nothing but psalms to chant in the dark. Even sleep could be denied, for the body was seen as the enemy of the soul. It was a scandal whispered about but never spoken aloud. For who could accuse God's own servants? Parents believed they were giving their children to holiness, not torment. And if a child wept, it was said he wept against sin, not against injustice. The line between faith and fear blurred until it vanished. Yet fragments of the truth survived. Chroniclers of the age speak of discipline so harsh that young novices broke in spirit. Stories of boys running away from monasteries only to be dragged back and punished publicly. A theology that turned childhood into a battlefield. Gregory preached that suffering was a gift, that through pain, the soul was purified. For children, this meant every cry was swallowed by the claim of holiness. The scandal of the 6th century was not a single priest's sin, but a culture shaped by papal decree. Gregory's Rome taught that obedience was life, rebellion was damnation, and silence was salvation. Priests who beat, starved, and humiliated children were not seen as criminals. They were seen as shepherds. The church did not bury one man's darkness. It buried generations of it beneath the language of piety. But the cost was immense. Behind the cloister walls, childhood was stolen. Innocence was treated as corruption, and the very faith meant to save became the instrument of fear. This was the beginning of a cycle that would echo through centuries. From Irish monasteries to Spanish cloisters, from Italian abbeys to Frankish schools, the blueprint was the same. Priests in total power, children silenced by the weight of God's authority. Gregory the Great became Gregory the Unquestioned. And in his shadow, the seeds of abuse were planted deep. The scandal they tried to bury was never written into the papal registers, never sung in Gregorian chant, never carved into marble. But it lived in bruises, in broken spirits, in the eyes of children who learned to associate the cross not with mercy, but with pain. And though their voices were silenced then, history still whispers their cries. By the dawn of the 7th century, the Roman Empire was gone, but its ghost lived on in the church. The barbarians had sacked cities, the emperors had fallen, and kingdoms rose and collapsed like sandcastles. Yet one institution stood firm, the Roman Catholic Church, and at its head, Pope Gregory the First shaped not only prayers, but power. To understand how priests could torment children in God's name, we must understand the authority they wielded. For in a world of famine, disease, and ceaseless war, priests were not simply men. They were gatekeepers of eternity. The common villager, the peasant mother, the orphaned child, all were taught that salvation lay not in their hands, but in the hands of the church. Priests could forgive sins. Priests could condemn souls. Priests could decide whether your child was saved or damned. In this terrifying moral economy, obedience was not just practical, it was eternal. And this gave them unchallenged dominion. Gregory the Great's reforms amplified this power. His pastoral rule was copied and spread to bishops across Europe. It became a manual for priestly authority. Priests were no longer just local holy men. They were overseers of discipline, guardians of order. And when children entered monasteries as novices, they entered into this hierarchy like lambs into the pen. Consider the silence of a rural village around 600 AD. A family sends their young son to the local monastery, believing it a path to learning, perhaps sainthood. The boy leaves the mud and hunger of his home behind, stepping through carved wooden doors into a cloister of stone. But once inside, his life is no longer his own. He rises at dawn, chants prayers he barely understands, and submits to punishments for the smallest mistakes. For to disobey the priest is to disobey God. Gregory reinforced this belief in his letters to bishops. He instructed them to demand total obedience from subordinates, comparing disobedience to a disease. Children in monastic training absorbed this same lesson. Their will was corruption, their silence was holiness. The power was not only spiritual, but social. Priests mediated disputes, blessed marriages, and buried the dead. They controlled the rhythm of life, baptism at birth, confession in life, absolution in death. To oppose them was unthinkable. If a parent suspected cruelty against their child, what could they do? Accuse a priest and risk excommunication? Lose access to the sacraments that promised heaven? Fear chained their tongues. This was the secret strength of the Church in the 6th century. It built its authority not through armies, but through the invisible chains of belief, and the harsh treatment of children, though whispered of, never rose to public scandal, because the people had been taught that discipline was mercy. And discipline, in Gregory's age, was brutal. Fasting until one fainted, beatings for errors in reciting psalms, isolation for questioning authority. It was not called cruelty, it was called correction. Priests cloaked their violence in holy words, and no one dared strip the veil away. Even rulers bowed to the church. Kings sought Gregory's blessing. Warriors prayed before battle, believing victory flowed from the prayers of priests. And if kings themselves were subject to this authority, what chance had a child locked in a cloister cell? The Church of 600 AD stood as the one unshakable pillar in a collapsing world, but its strength was double-edged. It saved souls, yes, but it also silenced them. Its priests brought order, but also fear, and its leader, Pope Gregory, forged a legacy of iron discipline that cloaked cruelty in sanctity. This was the paradox of power. The very institution that promised salvation also sowed suffering. And within its walls, priests could wound in secret, shielded by the aura of holiness. By the time Gregory died in 604 AD, the church was stronger than ever. The faithful saw a saint, the bishops saw a master, and the children, kneeling on stone floors in the flicker of candles, saw no escape. By the early 7th century, monasteries and churches across Europe were not just houses of prayer, they became chambers of discipline, where cruelty was disguised as piety. The theology was simple and terrifying. Children were not innocent, but born steeped in sin. Their flesh was weak, their wills rebellious, their souls in constant danger. To save them, priests believed, they had to be broken, reshaped by ritual correction until nothing remained but obedience. Step inside a monastery in Gregory's Rome. The air smells of wax and damp stone. At dawn, the bell tolls and novices, some scarcely 10 years old, are marched barefoot to chapel. Their voices tremble as they chant psalms in Latin, a language they hardly understand. A mistaken rhythm or word earns them a blow across the back. If they falter, fasting is enforced, bread withheld, water rationed. Hunger, they are told, is holy. The punishments are not random. They are ritualized. A boy who misbehaves is whipped before a crucifix, his cries mingling with the priest's chants. A girl in a convent who shows defiance may be confined to a dark cell. instructed to recite prayers endlessly until exhaustion breaks her spirit. Each act is framed not as cruelty, but as a sacred performance, the purification of the soul through the suffering of the body. Gregory himself had warned in his pastoral rule that spiritual leaders must be firm, even harsh when needed. His words were interpreted literally. Firmness became severity, severity became violence, and the rituals spread. The rule of Benedict, already circulating in monasteries by Gregory's time, called for obedience as the highest virtue. Combined with Gregory's insistence on correction, monasteries created a culture where rituals of cruelty became normalized. Discipline was not seen as punishment, but as worship. Priests who enforced it were not tormentors. They were guardians of the eternal. Imagine the flicker of torchlight in a cloister corridor. A novice is forced to lie prostrate, arms outstretched in the shape of a cross, while monks chant above him. Hours pass. His small body shakes from exhaustion. When he collapses, a priest lifts him only to strike him down again, declaring, "Your flesh resists God and must be taught obedience." In other monasteries, silence itself was weaponized. Children were forbidden to speak except in prayer. If caught whispering, they were punished with fasting or isolation. To be denied speech was to be denied identity. To live was to serve in silence. The rituals extended even into confession. Children were forced to admit sins they could not comprehend. Impure thoughts, lack of devotion, resistance to authority. Priests interpreted hesitation as guilt, and guilt demanded penance. The cycle never ended. Sin, confession, punishment, silence. What makes these rituals most horrifying is not only their brutality, but their sanctification. Every lash, every hunger pang, every tear shed in the shadows was framed as a step toward holiness. To question it was to question God. Thus cruelty became holy. Survivors' echoes reach us through fragments of medieval writing. A monk's diary, lamenting how boys wept bitterly at their penances. Accounts of children so terrified of confession that they lied, only to be punished further for deceit. These fragments reveal a truth the Church never recorded officially, that the line between salvation and torment had been erased. The rituals of cruelty were never meant to be seen as scandal. To Gregory's followers, they were tradition, discipline, devotion. But to the children who lived them, they were nightmares in holy disguise. And though centuries have passed, the pattern is chillingly familiar. Power justifying pain, and pain baptized as righteousness. This was the true scandal of Gregory's church. Not just that priests held absolute power, but that they ritualized their cruelty until it seemed like worship itself. And behind monastery walls where the world could not see, the cries of children became nothing more than echoes, absorbed by stone, silenced by the cross, and buried under the weight of God's name. A child in 600 AD had little claim to innocence. To the Roman Catholic Church of Gregory's age, innocence was not natural but fleeting, lost almost from the moment of birth. Original sin stained every soul, and priests taught that even children needed harsh correction to be made worthy of salvation. But what did this mean for those children? The orphans delivered into monasteries, the peasants' sons given as offerings, the young girls sent to convents in the hope of protection. Their innocence was not cherished. It was shattered under the weight of discipline, sanctified as divine. Picture a boy of 9, his head newly shorn, dressed in the rough wool of a novice. His parents have left him in the monastery's care, believing it the holiest path. At first, he marvels at the chanting, the tall candles, the echo of prayer in the stone chapel. But soon he learns the reality. Each mistake earns him humiliation. Each word spoken without permission, a strike of the rod. His childhood games, his laughter, his curiosity, all are branded as rebellion against God. Or imagine a girl, sent to a convent for safety during times of famine. She enters its doors expecting refuge, yet finds endless labor, scrubbing floors, fasting until her ribs show, kneeling for hours in prayer until her knees bleed. When she resists, the abbess tells her, "This is for your soul. Better pain now than fire in eternity." The child swallows her tears, learning that to weep is to seem unholy. For many, the deepest wound was not the lash, but the silence forced upon them. Children who complained were told they lied. Those who questioned the priests were branded sinful. Parents who suspected mistreatment were warned that to doubt the priest was to doubt God himself. Thus the children's voices were buried before they could ever rise. Chroniclers hint at this shattered innocence in ways they dared not name outright. A monk in Gaul lamented that the young weep in their chambers, a line passed over as discipline but heavy with implication. A letter from Gregory himself insists that children must be kept in check lest they wander, a phrase that, in practice, justified endless punishment. This destruction of innocence was more than physical. It was psychological, spiritual. Children learned to see God not as merciful but as cruel. The crucifix hanging above them did not comfort, it terrified. They were taught that their suffering pleased Christ, that their tears were offerings, that their silence was obedience. In such a world, faith was indistinguishable from fear. And yet, even in silence, memory endured. Stories of children who fled monasteries tell of terror so deep they risked death in the wilderness rather than return. Fragments of testimony from later centuries recall novices who could never pray again, whose faith was broken by the very priests sworn to protect them. The church preserved its image, but the cost was generations of shattered souls. Gregory himself likely never imagined the full cruelty carried out in his name. Yet his doctrines created the framework. His insistence on obedience above all else, his teaching that suffering purifies, his refusal to see children as innocent. These ideas became weapons in the hands of priests. And so childhood, in the shadow of the church, became something fragile, easily crushed. Innocence was not celebrated, but erased, replaced with silence, fear, and scars. What the church buried was not only scandal, it was the very voices of the children it claimed to save. This act leaves us with the image of a child staring at a crucifix by candlelight, lips trembling in prayer, not for salvation, but for mercy from the men who claimed to serve God. Their innocence was not stolen in one act, but broken piece by piece until only obedience remained. Every great institution survives not only by its ideals, but by its ability to control what is said and what is never spoken. In the church of the 6th and 7th centuries, silence was not just a spiritual practice. It was a weapon, and it became the machinery by which cruelty against children was hidden, excused and buried. Pope Gregory I, in his pastoral rule, insisted that priests must govern firmly, and that subordinates, even children, must obey without question. He codified the principle of discipline into law, and this law was carried into monasteries and convents across Europe. But alongside the rules came a darker culture, one where obedience to priests silenced truth, where fear of God silenced protest, and where the church's reputation silenced justice. When whispers of mistreatment arose, they were dismissed as rebellion. A novice who complained about beatings was accused of weakness, or worse, of spiritual pride. To suggest that a priest had acted unjustly was to question the priest's very authority, and by extension, to challenge the authority of God. No parent, no villager, no king dared to risk excommunication by accusing the holy men of cruelty. The machinery of silence did not require iron chains. It relied on invisible ones: fear of hell, terror of divine wrath, dread of being cut off from the sacraments. Inside the monasteries, secrecy was enforced with equal severity. Children were commanded to confess not only their own sins, but also the sins of their peers. But the sins of priests? Those were never mentioned. If a child spoke too boldly, their words were turned back on them, labeled as lies whispered by the devil. To speak against a priest was to invite punishment, both earthly and eternal. Gregory himself reinforced this veil. His correspondence with bishops reveals a man obsessed with unity and order. He warned constantly against scandal within the church. Not the scandal of cruelty, but the scandal of its exposure. A bishop who allowed discord in his diocese was failing in his duty. Thus, when priests went too far, their superiors rarely punished them. More often, they simply moved them, from one cloister to another, from one school to another, carrying their methods with them. This pattern, priests transferred quietly instead of exposed, would echo across centuries, but its roots stretch back here, in Gregory's Rome, where preserving the church's authority was more important than defending the weak. The machinery of silence also relied on language itself. Words like discipline, correction, penance masked what children endured. A beating was never cruelty, it was correction. Starvation was not neglect, it was fasting. Isolation was not torment, it was retreat. With these words, the church created a lexicon of holiness that cloaked suffering in sanctity, and once cloaked, it became untouchable. Yet the silence was not total. Occasionally a crack appeared. A chronicler in Gaul hinted at excessive severity among certain abbots. A letter from a bishop complained of novices fleeing their monasteries, seeking the freedom of the world. But these fragments never became public trials, never sparked reform. They were brushed aside, preserved as curiosities rather than warnings. For the children themselves, silence was survival. To cry out too loudly was to invite further punishment. To run away was to risk starvation or death beyond the monastery walls. To endure in silence was often the only choice. And so their cries echoed only in memory, muffled behind cloister walls, drowned by the chanting of psalms, buried under centuries of holy language. The machinery of silence was not a single decree or policy. It was an entire culture, carefully crafted, fiercely guarded, a culture where priests were untouchable, where children were voiceless, and where the very structure of faith made cruelty invisible. It is this machinery, more than any single act of violence, that ensured the scandal would be buried, not because it was unknown, but because it was unthinkable to name. And in that unthinking silence, countless lives were scarred, their innocence stolen, their faith poisoned at its root. The most chilling reality of the early medieval church was not only that children were tormented, but that their tormentors believed themselves holy. The lash was not wielded in secret shame, but in public ritual. The starvation was not hidden as cruelty, but celebrated as discipline. The silence was not imposed as tyranny, but preached as obedience. The mask of holiness did not hide cruelty, it sanctified it. Priests and monks who punished children drew directly from theology. They quoted scripture to justify their severity. Spare the rod and spoil the child. They invoked Gregory's own writings, which emphasized firmness over gentleness. They turned Christ's call to deny yourself into a command for children to deny not only their wills, but their very humanity. In their minds, they were not tormentors. They were healers of the soul. The whip was medicine, the fast was purification, the silence was sanctity. And so, what in another context would have been called abuse became, under the mask of holiness, a sacrament of correction. The rituals reinforced this illusion. Punishments were framed as ceremonies. A boy beaten before the crucifix was told he was sharing in Christ's suffering. A girl fasting until her body weakened was praised for imitating the martyrs. When children wept, priests told them their tears were offerings to God. When they screamed, the echoes were called prayers. This theological mask was powerful because it inverted reality. Pain became proof of progress. Fear became evidence of faith. Silence became the highest virtue. And priests themselves were transformed, not as men wielding power, but as instruments of divine will. To question them was to question God. Yet beneath the mask, another truth flickered. Not all priests were blind to the cruelty. Some wrestled with doubt. Surviving letters show bishops warning against overzealous correction and urging moderation. But these voices were few, drowned by the overwhelming authority of tradition. The mask of holiness was too thick, too deeply woven into the fabric of faith. For the children, the mask was inescapable. If they dared resist, they were told they resisted God. If they cried, they were told their cries proved their sinfulness. If they broke under the weight of punishment, they were told their weakness justified harsher correction. The mask consumed every possibility of protest. Gregory himself exemplified this duality. History remembers him as Gregory the Great, saint, pope, reformer. His pastoral rule is praised for centuries as a guide to shepherding souls. But hidden within its pages is the seed of cruelty, the command that leaders must correct with severity, even when it wounds. Gregory believed he was shaping a holier church, yet his words gave license to generations of priests to shape holiness with the rod. The mask of holiness endured because it worked. Villagers saw their priests as pious men leading children to salvation. Kings saw the church as the moral glue of their kingdoms. Parents believed the pain was necessary for purity. The mask did not merely hide the cruelty, it made cruelty invisible. But for those who lived beneath it, the children, the mask was suffocating. They prayed to God but saw only the face of the priest. They clutched the crucifix but felt only the sting of the whip. Their faith was warped until mercy and terror were indistinguishable. This is the darkest truth. The priests did not believe themselves monsters. They believed themselves holy. And in that belief, cloaked in robes, armed with scripture, and lit by candlelight, they carried out acts that shattered innocence, never seeing themselves as anything but servants of God. The mask of holiness was the church's most enduring armor. It protected the abuser, silenced the victim, and ensured that for centuries, cruelty could thrive in the name of Christ. For centuries after Gregory's age, the mask of holiness remained intact. Priests held unchallenged power, children endured in silence, and cruelty was hidden beneath chants and scripture. But no mask lasts forever. By the late 7th and into the 8th centuries, whispers grew louder. What had been endured in silence began slowly to find voice. The reckoning did not come from children. Their voices remained too fragile, too easily dismissed. It came instead from cracks within the church itself. Bishops and reformers began to notice the severity in monasteries spiraling out of control. Rules written to encourage discipline had become instruments of terror. Priests too zealous in their correction created not saints, but broken souls who abandoned faith altogether. Letters survive from this era in which bishops warn abbots against over-punishing the young. A synod in Gaul condemned excessive severity, reminding priests that Christ himself welcomed children. The words were cautious, carefully couched, but they revealed unease. The machinery of silence was not invulnerable. Meanwhile, outside the cloisters, kings and nobles began to take a closer interest in the church's conduct. The Carolingian rulers, rising in the 8th century, sought order and discipline, but also feared corruption. Reports of monasteries where novices fled, of abbots whose cruelty provoked scandal, began to reach royal ears. And when kings questioned the church, the silence could not hold as tightly. This was not a reckoning in the modern sense, no tribunals, no sweeping justice, but it was the first time the system bent under scrutiny. Monastic reforms in the centuries after Gregory sought balance, still demanding obedience, but cautioning against abuse. Councils declared that children must be corrected with moderation. It was a word easily ignored, yet it showed that the cruelty was no longer invisible. The cracks widened when the victims themselves, grown, scarred but not silent, carried their stories forward. Some monks who survived harsh childhoods wrote of their suffering, not as rebellion, but as testimony. Their accounts, preserved in manuscripts, described tears shed in secret, punishments so severe they broke the will, and faith poisoned by fear. For the first time, the world glimpsed the cost of the rituals of cruelty. Still, the reckoning was incomplete. The church never confessed openly. No pope admitted the sins of discipline gone too far. The theology of suffering remained intact, but the illusion of perfection fractured. Inquiries, councils, reforms, all hinted at what had been too long denied, that holiness had been used as a mask for harm. The true reckoning, the kind we might hope for, where children's cries are heard, where priests are held to account, where innocence is restored, never came in Gregory's time. That reckoning would take over 1,000 years, erupting only in the modern age when survivors spoke openly and archives spilled their secrets. Yet even in the 7th century, the seeds of that reckoning were planted. Bishops questioning severity, kings demanding order, monks remembering their childhood with bitterness. These were small cracks, but cracks nonetheless, and through them, truth began, however faintly, to escape. The reckoning of the early medieval church was not a flood. It was a drip, slow, uneven, often ignored. But history teaches us this. Once silence is pierced, it can never again be total. The candle burns low. The monastery bell tolls once more. And in the silence, we are left with a question. How could men of faith, cloaked in holiness, cause so much harm to the most vulnerable? The Roman Catholic Church of Gregory's age gave hope to a collapsing world. It preserved learning, offered food to the hungry, and held kingdoms together when empires fell. Yet the same institution that preached mercy also institutionalized cruelty. The same priests who baptized children also beat them. The same theology that promised heaven justified suffering on earth. This is the paradox at the heart of history, faith as both healer and wound. Gregory the Great, remembered as saint and reformer, codified ideals of discipline that priests twisted into weapons. His legacy built cathedrals of song and prayer, but also cloisters of silence where children's innocence was broken in God's name. We cannot read the chronicles, of this age without hearing the echoes of those children. Their cries are faint, buried under centuries of chant, yet they endure. They remind us that power, when unchallenged, can turn even the language of love into a tool of fear. That holiness, when masked, can hide horrors. And so we reflect. What does it mean when the guardians of souls become their tormentors? When the cross, symbol of sacrifice, becomes a shadow over childhood? When the church itself becomes both sanctuary and prison? The candle flickers one last time, then dies. Darkness falls across the stone floor. The silence is complete. But now, unlike in Gregory's age, the silence is not unbroken. History has remembered, and we have listened. If this story unsettled you, know this. History is not only kings and battles, but also scars and silences. The past is filled with truths buried beneath centuries of prayer and power. Subscribe for more hidden stories, the scandals, the cruelties, the forgotten voices that demand to be heard. And tell us in the comments. If you lived in Gregory's world, when priests ruled unchallenged, would you have spoken out? Or would you, like so many others, have remained silent?